The history of Brazil is fascinating, but in order to understand it rightly, you have to go back in time, and you have to really go back to a time when the world was divided between East and West, when the Pope divided the world between the Spanish and the Portuguese. In June 7th, 1494, the Pope uniquely divided the world into two, and it was called the Treaty of Tordesillas. And it was a treaty, an agreement between Portugal and Spain, between the royal courthouses of Portugal and Spain, of Ferdinand II and Queen Isabella, King John II of Portugal. This treaty was signed and agreed upon between all parties involved, between the Spanish and Portuguese, 2 years after the discovery of the New World by Christopher Columbus in 1492. Now, in the beginning, Portugal really didn't pay attention too much to Brazil because they were distracted and largely invested financially, should I say heavily, in the Eastern Indies, in the far east of coastlands of Asia. In Spain, however, they were totally sold on the new territories discovered in the Western world, the Western Hemisphere, the New World. It wasn't until several years later, in the year 1500, when a discoverer, explorer, navigator named Pedro Alvarez was the one who accidentally discovered the continent that we know now as South America, the nation and country of Brazil. What was Brazil like before the arrival of the gospel? Well, you really have to put in context where this part of the world, where the state was, spiritually speaking. It was an unreached area. It was an unknown area, a very big area in terms of mileage and mountain ranges and deserts and all kinds of ecosystems. So like the people were very numerous, of course. The Portuguese thought it was 7 million in total population, but that was nowhere near 7 million. It was probably way, way in the higher double digits, maybe in the 40, 50 millions. You know what I mean? Because there was no way that the Portuguese knew or conducted any kind of census to actually count every single person. So they had no clue how many natives were living in Brazil or in South America for that matter. So, the spiritual condition of the natives, the unreached people groups in Brazil, was vastly similar to the natives and the tribes of Mexico and Central America, in which Hernan Cortez was encountering in Mexico and in the area of the Yucatan. Now, the Portuguese were not ignorant of the spiritual condition of these native tribes and these people groups that were encountered in Brazil. Passages like Ephesians chapter 2 verse 12 comes to mind, probably in the minds of the Portuguese explorers and missionaries that eventually landed in Brazil and ventured out in the wilderness. And it reads, in the NIV version, by the way, and it reads, "Remember that at that time you were separated from Christ, excluded from citizenship in Israel, and foreigners to the covenants of the promise, without hope and without God in the world." I think this text right here, Paul's talking about, he's trying to tell the Ephesian Christians, the Ephesians, who were not, Jews. So they were not born in Jerusalem or in Israel. They were foreigners. They were like somebody outside of that country, outside of the religion of Judaism, and foreigners to the covenants of Abraham, the covenants of Moses, and they were without hope and without God in the world. Notice the last phrase, without God in the world. In the minds of the Portuguese, that they understood this basic principle is that these people were indeed created in the image of God, but they were without God, the true God, in the world. And it was up to them to bring the gospel to these people group. Now, no doubt about it that the Portuguese encountered, what was called, obviously the work of Satan in these tribes, because they witnessed, human sacrifice. They witnessed slavery. They witnessed all kinds of sexual perversities, live burials. The practices of these natives were not, kind and innocent. Now, that's not to say that every tribe participated in these cruel and pagan practices, but no doubt that these were the works of the sons of disobedience that, Paul talks about again to the Ephesians. And, it was largely because the power of the air, the spirit, that is now in work of the sons of disobedience, the power of Satan that was going unchecked for generations in the Western world outside of Europe across the Atlantic Ocean. Now, as the Portuguese began to settle down in the coastal areas of Brazil, a lot of the native population started to decline rapidly within the first few decades because their immunities were not, strong enough to battle against the alien bacteria and these new diseases that came into this part of the world that was never there before. And therefore, a large part of the decline of the native populations has to do with these new advent of diseases and bacteria. In some cases, sadly, wiped out entire native tribes in Brazil. So the spiritual condition of Brazil was nothing less than a horror film. It was horror. It was cannibalistic. It was very pagan. It was very scary, I guess, to use a modern term. The Portuguese had no idea what to do with these people other than to give them the hope of the gospel. And now that doesn't neglect or excuse the Portuguese, because the Portuguese have a lot of faults of their own. And they actually, they did curse the idols. They did put to death the murderers. They did capture the criminals of the tribes. And they did put down all kinds of tyranny type rulers, the tyranny, dictators that were, enslaving thousands of other natives. They put an end to that. But, with one tyranny, comes in another tyranny. And that's exactly what the Portuguese ushered in with a horrible attempt to reach the lost and evangelize and disciple the nations for Christ. So instead of doing that, they actually brought in a new era of tyranny of their own. This actually reminds me of another scripture, and it comes from the Gospel of Luke, chapter 11, verse 26. Once again, I'm reading from the NIV, and it reads, "Then it goes and takes 7 other spirits more wicked than itself, and they go in and live there. And the final condition of that person is worse than the first." And I think this is exactly what happened in Brazil once the Portuguese came in and ended one evil regime and ushered in another evil regime that was pretty much worse than the first, because this is what happened. Now, the Portuguese did a lot to contribute to Europe and to the world when it comes to navigation, when it comes to science and art and culture and music. They did a lot for the world in that aspect. But the Portuguese were not missionary minded. They were not out there to seek the souls for redemption, to claim them for heaven. Now, they would like to think that they brought the gospel just by the virtue of them being the Roman Catholic nation in terms of population, but they did very little to disciple the nations. Do you know what I mean? They did very little to train up the individuals in which they encountered in Brazil. And this is the legacy of the Portuguese Empire, the Portuguese people that came into Brazil, South America. They didn't train. And all they did was look at them as, part of the enterprise. They could contribute to make us bigger, larger, more money. How can these people contribute to our empire? Not the other way around. Not like, how can we help them, right? But how can they help us be number one? And that was the mindset of, should I say, the spiritual condition of the Portuguese on the other side. Yes, the ancient Brazilians were pagan, cannibalistic, and they were living in the world without God. But if you look on the other side of that same coin, the Portuguese themselves were without God largely because they neglected to train, make disciples, fulfill the Great Commission, and they were largely, doing a military operation. They were largely looking for gold. They were out there looking for land and new opportunities to become number one in the whole world and not number one in the kingdom of God. Although they did bring Roman Catholicism to these natives, and they did do a good thing in ending a lot of the atrocities. But in the process, they themselves became the main atrocity producer in Brazil. And one of those atrocities that began in Brazil by the Portuguese was to launch the new era of the transatlantic slave trade that started because of the discovery of Brazil, I think in Later on in 1526, this is when it first happened, when the demand just skyrocketed for a new workforce. And this was caused because the population of the native tribes actually declined so rapidly due to the outbreak of the pestilence and the plagues and the new bacterias, that their bodies and immune systems were not built to stand against it. They had no chance. So the population of the natives soon after, within 20 years or so, declined so rapidly that it forced the surviving members of the tribes in Brazil to actually migrate more inland to the Amazon basin and to hide themselves and to find survival and shelter away from these strange new bacteria and diseases that was wreaking havoc in their populations. So this created a problem economically for the Portuguese, and for the lack of imagination and for the lack of love and humanity, and mostly because of the lack of the gospel in their hearts and minds, they resorted to starting the transatlantic trade slavery. They went to Africa and they said, hey, all these other people died, so let's go to Africa and bring more people. Let's enslave them so they could work for us. And let's never let them go. They are our slaves, and they have new resistance. They said that the people in Africa are more resistant to bacteria and to the European diseases. Now, this is not true, obviously, but they thought so. And that's the motivation to go and replenish the workforce that was so demanded in Brazil. And that's why when you go to Brazil today, it's so diverse. It is so enrichly diverse. Probably the most diverse place in the Western world, perhaps in the world. When you look at secular sources of history, when it comes to the history of Christianity in Brazil, a lot of people like to take a secular view and say there was a lot of genocide and gross misbehavior by the Europeans, and a lot of that is true. But however, a lot of people like to lean on the Catholic history of Christianity in Brazil by associating the arrival of the Portuguese as the advent of Christianity in South America, especially in Brazil, which is simply not true. Now, the next logical question would be, what does the Reformation has to do with the history of Brazil, or where was the Reformation with the colonization of Brazil? And you do have to look at it in context, because everything that I said so far really does play into the church's history in Brazil currently, as in the year 2020 and beyond, because all of these things provide the better context. And context matters, especially when you're looking at history, especially when you're looking at history from a biblical worldview and not a secular or Roman Catholic worldview. There is a neat little book called Sketches from Church History. Is one of my favorite books. I just love that book. Let me go ahead and quote just a little section of it. And this is from page 202. I think it does a phenomenal job in answering in a very easy way this very question and subject. And let me quote from page 202. And I quote, "The fact is indisputable that revivals of true Christianity issue in missionary effort. In the absence of revival and of a healthy church life, missionary interest and effort alike languish. Some may be inclined to dispute the claim, however, by asking in what way the preaching of the gospel to the heathen was a result of the 16th century Reformation. Well, the answer is that the Reformation itself was a great missionary effort, the mission field being Central and Western Europe, areas which, although not heathen, were grossly ignorant of the gospel of the grace of God. Not until medieval darkness had been dispelled could the true light shine out to other parts of the world." That's not a technical response to the issue, but I just love how it's a bird's eye view response. And it answers the questions really nicely to say that how can you reach a heathen world, where there's cannibals and there's really no, legit civilization. If the civilization that you're in, and what I mean by this in Portugal and Spain and mostly Europe, were mostly ignorant themselves of the gospel. They were ignorant that you were saved by grace alone. Up until then, by the year 1500, when Brazil was discovered, yes, it was discovered by, Roman Catholics, right? But it was not discovered in the name of Christ, obviously. And they were ignorant of, God's grace, which is free, And up until this time, Europe was still stuck in the medieval understanding of justification, which was not by faith alone, which was by works. It was grace plus your works, which was the sales of indulgences and all kinds of gross corruptions by the Roman Catholics, both in Spain and in Portugal. And plus, you have to factor in the Inquisition. The Inquisition, which is a whole different history in itself, really did an impact, pretty much putting any chances out of the equation for the Reformation to ever take root in Spain and in Portugal. So this is why the Portuguese and the Spanish still to this day are largely Roman Catholic and still largely ignorant of the true gospel of Jesus Christ. So how are you going to reach the world if the world that you live in, that are your closest neighbors, are not in fact saved? All right, I'm going to have to end this video right here before it goes any further. This concludes part one of my mini series of missionary history. This one is part one of Brazil, so stay tuned to see part two coming out soon. Until then, please consider supporting me by liking the video below, sharing the link, dropping me a comment, as well as hitting the little bell notification for future videos. Stay tuned for part two coming out soon. And don't forget to go ahead and hit up Twitter and Instagram and follow me at the Chicano Knox. And don't forget to give me a 5-star rating on your podcast applications, because my podcast is available on Spotify, Google Podcasts, Radio Republic, wherever podcasts can be found. So go ahead and hit me up on Twitter. Let me know what you think. And until next time, God bless, grace and peace.